A station hand on the Darling Downs in 1931 could walk off the track into dry scrub country, read the land beneath his feet, and find himself a drink of clean water before the sun moved 3 hand widths across the sky. He needed no equipment and no help. He needed only what someone had shown him in a paddock outside Goondiwindi when he was 12 years old. He was not special. He was educated in a way we no longer bother with. Here are 3 things you will hear in this video. Number 14 was quietly made commercially unviable under a Commonwealth food standard in 1972, yet researchers have confirmed it produces a chemically sounder result than the approved industrial method that replaced it. Number 7 is a skill whose last known practitioner in the Riverina carried it to her grave outside Deniliquin in 2011. And number 2 was so effective that a multinational corporations spent the equivalent of $40 million in today's currency on Australian advertising between 1955 and 1965 to convince rural families it was backward. The grandmothers were right. We just forgot to ask before they were gone. These are not quaint curiosities. They are survival technologies developed over generations by men and women who could not afford to be wrong. Subscribe now. We start the countdown. Number 20. Reading a dry creek bed for soakage water. Stand in the bed of a dry creek on the Barkly tableland in August, and you are standing above water. Pioneer stockmen, building on knowledge held by Aboriginal Australians across the Channel Country for millennia, could read the soil color at the outside bend of a dry watercourse and know within a few meters where to dig. Never dig in the middle of the channel. The water has moved on from there. Dig at the outside of the bend in soil that has shifted from red to the color of old iron. A ring of river couch grass in otherwise gray saltbush country meant water within arm's reach. A bore drilled in outback Queensland today costs between $40,000 and $70,000. The soakage takes a shovel and 40 minutes. Number 19. Making lye soap from wood ash and fat. Every farm kitchen in Depression-era Australia produced this soap, and almost none of them wrote the method down, because everyone already knew it. You leached hardwood ash, preferably from ironbark or river red gum, with rainwater until the liquid could float a fresh egg without sinking. That was your alkali strength test. You combined the lye with rendered mutton fat, 1 part lye to 2 parts fat, heated it slowly in a cast iron pot, and stirred until it traced, meaning it held a line when you dragged a spoon through it. Never use pine ash. The resin carries through and the soap will not set. A bar of artisan tallow soap at a Sydney market today sells for between $8 and $14. Your great-grandmother made hers from waste materials that cost her nothing. Number 18. Blade shearing and the long blow. Jim Power, an Australian shearer working around 1905, developed the technique known as the long blow, a continuous stroke running the full length of a merino's back in a single fluid movement that left the fleece intact and the skin uncut. The legendary Jackie Howe set the blade shearing record at 321 sheep in a single day at Bernia Station in Queensland in 1892. At the peak of the wool boom of 1951, skilled blade shearers maintained daily tallies of between 150 and 200 head. The last generation who taught the long blow as a working craft retired from the sheds of the Riverina in the late 1990s. Nobody wrote it down. It is very nearly gone. Number 17. Rendering dripping and storing it without refrigeration. A gallon of rendered beef dripping, stored correctly, kept a station family's cooking fat from April through to the following February, without a refrigerator. Fat was cut small, packed cold into a heavy pot with a 1/4 cup of water, and heated slowly until the connective tissue separated and sank. Never let the fat color past pale gold. Brown dripping has already begun to break down and will not keep. The clarified fat went into a clean, dry stoneware crock, and a thin salt layer on the surface added another 6 weeks of shelf life. Research published by the Harvard School of Public Health found that naturally rendered animal fats do not raise low-density lipoprotein the way partially hydrogenated vegetable oils do. The grandmothers were right. Modern nutrition spent 60 years telling Australians otherwise. Number 16. Preserving eggs in water glass. Sodium silicate, which country people called water glass, was sold in small tins at general stores across rural New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland from the 1880s onward. A solution of 1 part water glass to 9 parts boiled, cooled water filled a stoneware crock, and fresh unwashed eggs were lowered in and submerged. The silicate sealed the microscopic pores of the eggshell and stopped bacterial ingress. Eggs, kept this way, remained edible and bake-ready for up to 12 months. Never use a cracked egg. Never use a washed egg. The bloom on the shell is the first layer of protection, and the water glass is the second. By 1965, commercial egg refrigeration and supermarket chains had made the practice obsolete in a single decade. Number 15. Making and reading a camp oven damper. There is a skill in making damper in a camp oven buried in coals that has nothing to do with the recipe and everything to do with reading the fire. The coals had to be ash white on the outside with a red interior. Not orange red, which is too hot, not gray, which is spent. The camp oven sat on a bed of those coals, never directly on ground that still held moisture. The damper itself was 3 cups of self-raising flour, a pinch of salt, and enough water to bring it together. Never knead it. A kneaded damper is a tough damper. Reading the smell of the crust at the 12-minute mark was the craft. The last stockman who held this as a daily camp necessity retired from the droving routes of the Kimberley through the 1970s. Here is where the tone of this list changes, because the next skills were not merely forgotten. Some were actively surrounded, outpaced, and regulated out of common practice by interests with a financial stake in the answer. Keep that in mind. Number 14. Corning and dry curing beef and mutton without refrigeration. A station wife in the Flinders Ranges in 1927 cured a leg of mutton her family ate across 6 weeks without a single hour of refrigeration. The dry cure used coarse salt, brown sugar, saltpeter, and black pepper rubbed hard into every surface, with the leg resting on a wooden rack for 3 days per kilogram so the liquor could drain freely. In 1972, the Commonwealth Food Safety Framework tightened the use of saltpeter in home food production, and the knowledge began to die quietly. Yet a study published by food scientists at the University of Adelaide found that the salt and nitrate concentrations used in traditional Australian dry cure methods fell within safe consumption limits, and well below those permitted in commercially cured supermarket products. A boutique leg of heritage dry-cured mutton at an Adelaide Hills farmer's market today sells for between $65 and $90. In 1927, it cost 1 shilling and 6 pence. Number 13. The perpetual sourdough starter. The farm kitchens of the Riverina and the Darling Downs kept a starter that in some families ran for decades. It lived in a clay crock on the bench, fed with a handful of flour and a splash of water every second day, and it leavened every loaf and batch of scones that came out of that kitchen. A healthy starter rises to a dome within 4 hours of feeding and smells of mild apple cider vinegar. Never use chlorinated town water in a starter. The chlorine kills the wild yeasts. Never use bleached flour as the sole feed, as the bleaching agents suppress the lactobacillus bacteria that give the bread its flavor. Research from the University of Queensland found that Australian wild yeast cultures are among the most diverse in the world because of the range of native flowering plants that host the relevant Saccharomyces species. The grandmothers were right. The chemistry was right all along. Number 12. Wattlebark tanning leather at home. Harvesting of black wattle, a currency for leather tanning, began in Victoria and southern New South Wales around the gold rushes of the 1850s. Black wattle contains tannin concentrations of between 30 and 45% in its bark, among the highest of any tree species in Australia. The hide was fleshed clean, soaked in wattle bark solution to remove the hair, then moved through progressively stronger tanning baths over 4 to 8 weeks. Never rush the tanning. Leather tanned too quickly is brittle and will crack within a season. By 1960, synthetic tanning chemicals had ended most home practice, and the traditional knowledge had almost no practitioners left. Number 11. Water divining with a forked mulga branch. This one will bring the skeptics out. Good. The men and women who used it never claimed it was magic. They described it as reading country. A forked branch of mulga, held loosely in both hands, was walked across ground where water was suspected. The practice combined the reading of surface vegetation, soil color, rock formation, and drainage patterns with whatever physical response the branch provided. The former chief executive of the CIRO stated publicly that he had seen experienced diviners achieve close to 80% accuracy in locating viable water sources. That is not an endorsement of the supernatural. It is an acknowledgement that country knowledge can produce results that expensive surveys sometimes cannot. Number 10. Building a bush timber smokehouse. Every station and many selector farms in the Riverina and the Western Districts maintained bush timber smokehouse through the first half of the 20th century. The timber for the frame was split ironbark or river red gum, never pine. Pine resin carries phenolic compounds into the smoke that taint the meat. River red gum produced a medium smoke suitable for mutton and pork. Ironbark produced a heavier, longer burning smoke suited to larger cuts. A properly cold smoked leg of mutton over red gum chips at between 60 and 80 degrees for 12 hours extended its safe shelf life by 3 to 4 weeks. The practice was marginalized by refrigeration in the 1950s and by state health guidelines from the 1980s. Number 9. Reading stock behavior across long distances. A head drover working the stock routes between Longreach and Charleville in the 1930s could read a mob of 1,000 mixed cattle from horseback at 300 meters and tell within an hour whether trouble was coming. Cattle moving in a loose, strung-out formation with heads low are comfortable. Cattle that cluster tightly and lift their heads repeatedly have caught a scent. Cattle that mill in a circle without moving forward are exhausted, or there is a predator in the arc off the lead animals. The last generation of drovers who worked this knowledge daily retired through the 1970s as road transport overtook the stock routes. We are now in the bottom half of this list, and this is where the government and the corporations really do enter the picture. From here to number 1, these skills were not merely forgotten. They were surrounded, outpaced, and in some cases deliberately displaced by interests with a financial stake in the answer. Number 8. Making vinegar from fruit and grain scraps. A Depression-era Queensland farm woman did not waste the leaves from a batch of jam, the skin and core of a bucket of peaches, or the bottom of a barrel of sorghum mash. She made vinegar. A mother of vinegar, a gelatinous mat of cellulose produced by Acetobacter bacteria, was kept in a ceramic crock and fed with new fruit liquor as each batch finished. Some of these mothers in central Queensland farmhouses were kept going for over 30 years. The practice fell out of use with the arrival of commercial vinegar through the 1950s. A bottle of unpasteurized apple cider vinegar with an active mother sells today for between $7 and $12. The raw materials cost less than $1 per liter. Number 7. Dry salting and pressing farm cheese with rennet from animal stomachs. The last woman in the Riverina who taught the traditional press-curd cheese method using rennet extracted from a calf's stomach lining passed away outside Deniliquin in 2011. That knowledge is gone unless someone in her family remembered enough to carry it forward. The method began with fresh whole milk heated to 32 degrees where the rennet enzyme works efficiently. A small piece of dried stomach lining soaked in cool water for an hour was stirred through the warm milk, which set to a curd in 40 minutes. The curd was cut, heated slowly, ladled into a cloth-lined mold, and pressed under a heavy stone for 48 hours. Salted and aged on a wooden board for 3 weeks, it produced a firm table cheese that modern farmhouse makers spend years trying to replicate. Food safety regulations tightened from the 1970s made shared production so legally complicated that the knowledge died in isolation. Number 6. Seed saving from open-pollinated vegetable varieties. A selector's wife on the southwest slopes of New South Wales in 1928 saved her own seed from every vegetable she grew. Tomatoes were selected from the best fruit on the most productive plants, dried on hessian in the sun for 3 weeks, and stored in a paper envelope in a dry tin. Beans were left on the vine until the pod turned papery, then shelled, aired, and stored. Never save seed from a hybrid variety. The first generation produces to specification, but the seed reverts in the second generation and is unpredictable. The arrival of commercial hybrid varieties, marketed aggressively through the 1950s and 60s, broke the seed-saving cycle in a single generation. Your great-grandmother's seed was free, was locally adapted, and improved with every passing year. Number 5. Stringy bark shelter building using timed bark stripping. A man building an outstation shelter before 1950 knew that stripping stringy bark had to happen in a window of approximately 6 weeks in late spring when the sap flowed freely. Strip it too early and the bark splits. Strip it too late and it will not peel in a useful sheet. Sheets were levered free with a wooden wedge and stacked flat under weight for 2 weeks to dry without curling. A flat sheet of stringy bark pinned to a ridge pole frame of green wattle produced a roof that was weatherproof, insulating, and naturally fire-resistant. The technique was already ancient when pioneer settlers adopted it, having been in use by Aboriginal Australians across the eastern ranges for thousands of years. Number 4. Hand-distilled eucalyptus oil for medicine and preserving. Joseph Bozisto, a pharmacist who settled in the Dandenong Ranges in the 1850s, established Australia's first eucalyptus oil distillery in 1854, building on knowledge long held by Aboriginal Australians. Bush families across Victoria and New South Wales extracted their own oil using pot still methods requiring nothing more than a copper pot, a coiled pipe in cold water, and fresh eucalyptus radiata leaves. The oil was a genuine antiseptic and expectorant. Concentrations from a competent home still ran between 60 and 80% cineol, which is the active compound. A bottle of pharmaceutical-grade eucalyptus oil at an Australian chemist today costs between $8 and $16 for 50 milliliters. Eucalyptus leaf grows across 7 million square kilometers of this country and costs nothing to collect. Number 3. Making tallow candles and rushlights from rendered fat. On a Gippsland dairy farm in 1905, the fat residue from the day's cheese-making was not discarded. It was clarified, skimmed clear, and used to dip cotton wicks in repeated layers until a candle had built to the correct diameter in 8 to 12 coats. Rushlights used the dried pith of common rushes found along every creek flat in the country, dipped once in tallow to produce a burning light lasting around 20 minutes. A tallow candle burned for between 4 and 6 hours. Never use tallow from a sick animal. The fat carries the infection and the candle will smell of it. The craft vanished with rural electrification, which reached most Victorian farms by the mid-1950s and most Queensland outstations by the early 1960s. Number 2. Home butchering and reading a carcass. A farm family on the Murrumbidgee in 1935 killed their own meat every 10 to 14 days through the cooler months. The skill was in the butchering, in the ability to read a carcass and take it apart, producing nothing but usable cuts, salvageable fat, organ meat, bone for stock, and hide for the tanner. A properly bled and hung young merino required between 3 and 5 days at cool air temperature before breaking down. Never break down a carcass before rigor has passed. The muscle fibers are contracted and the meat will be tough. The skilled home butcher read the flex of a foreleg joint to gauge readiness. Regulations introduced in the 1970s required licensed premises for slaughter intended for sale, which is reasonable. But those regulations arrived alongside a cultural shift that treated home slaughter for personal use as inherently suspect, and the teaching ceased within a generation. Number 1. Reading weather in the inland without instruments. A drover working a mob of 800 Hereford cattle from Longreach to Charleville in 1938 had no radio, no satellite image, and no weather service. What he had was the sky, the animals, and knowledge passed across campfires from the Channel Country to the Darling Downs. Cattle that lie down in the middle of a hot afternoon in flat country are not resting. They are lowering their profile against an approaching electrical disturbance. Gala flocks moving from north-northwest to south-southeast in the hour before sunset in summer are tracking a pressure change that will bring a southerly within 8 to 14 hours. High, thin cirrus clouds spread across a blue sky like a fish's backbone means significant rain within 36 hours. The CSIRO's Division of Atmospheric Research has published studies confirming that traditional weather indicators, based on animal behavior and plant phenology, correlate with measurable atmospheric conditions at rates significantly above chance. That knowledge walked out the door with the last droving generation, which retired from the inland routes of Queensland through the 1970s and 80s. As road transport finally ended the era, pick one, just one from this list. If you have never made lye soap, gather hardwood ash this week and start the leaching process. If you have a vegetable garden, let one tomato stay on the vine until it wrinkles and save what is inside. If you live near any creek flat or river margin, take a walk this evening and identify the rushes growing there. None of these things will take more than 20 minutes to begin. The beginning is all that is required. Here is the question for the comments. Which one of these skills did someone in your family actually practice? Which grandmother kept a sourdough starter for decades, or which grandfather did his own butchering on a cold winter morning every fortnight? Tell us, not because it is a curiosity, because it is evidence that this knowledge was real, was widespread, and was ordinary Australian life within living memory. Your grandparents knew how to feed themselves, shelter themselves, and read the country they lived in without purchasing a single thing they did not have to. That was not poverty. That was a kind of freedom that the modern world has made very difficult to access. Your grandparents knew. Now you know too.